Hello, everybody, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual component of the City Lights events calendar. I am your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we are delighted to have back in the house our dearly beloved Wayne Koestenbaum. He is celebrating the publication of a new book. It is called Stubble Archipelago, and it's published by our friends over at Semiotext Books down in Los Angeles. Before we begin, as is customary at the outset of each event, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people. Would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. So Wayne is one of those national treasures for us here at City Lights. I mean, his erudition, his humor, his curiosity, his prowess with language makes us instant fans of anything he produces. His new book arrives in the form of 36 poetic bulletins that explore a range of subjects, from the nuances of cruising to how to dream while walking around New York City with a flanneurish intent. He produced these wonderful, wonderful pieces. So Wayne would commit to his notebook or dictate into his phone many of the poetic treasures gracing the pages of this very delightful tome. Wayne is a poet, critic, novelist, artist, performer. He's published 19 books, which include such titles as The Queen's Throat, The Anatomy of Harpo Marx, Humiliation, best-selling Jewish porn films, amongst many others. His essays and poems have been widely published in periodicals and anthologies, including The Best American Poetry, Best American Essays. He's been in the New York Times, the Paris Review, and on and on and on. Formerly an associate professor of English at Yale and a visiting professor at the Yale School of Arts and Painting Department. He is distinguished professor of English, French, and comparative literature at CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. Joining him tonight is Tausif Noor. Tausif is a critic, curator, and PhD student in global modern art history at the University of California at Berkeley. His writing and essays have appeared in publications such as Artforum, the Poetry Project newsletter, the New York Review of Books, and the New Yorker, as well as various exhibition catalogs, artist books, and edited volumes. He makes his home in Oakland, California, but right now is coming to us from Uzbekistan. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Wayne and Tausif. A pleasure having you back with us again. And Tausif, great to have you in the house. Welcome to City Lights.
Well, here we are. I'm going to look at the gallery so I can see you, Tausif. There, now I
Yes.
see your beautiful face. You're
And I
really,
can
you're in a
see
hotel
yours.
and you're very, very, very far away. I think we need to
Yes.
stay
So
away with far awayness.
yes. I actually think it's funny. I was going to just start with that sort of distance that sort of occupies us right now, but the wonderful magic of technology that has allowed us all to sort of gather in this virtual room. And I think one of the one of the pleasures of doing this talk, before I start my day, it's currently 6 a.m. here, and I will be sort of trekking to a lot of museums of intense Soviet socialist art, which I'm very excited about. But I I'm so pleased that we can begin this conversation about um, both distance and intimacy, because I think one of the sort of pleasures of reading your work is that you sort of defy the inheritance that we have of Foucault, let's say, being like language is a prison. It's something that alienates us. It's something that, so it spreads us far apart. But I think which in your poetry and your criticism is to sort of take language, occupy it in these sort of restrictions. So if we can start by, as Peter wonderfully acknowledged, that Stubble Archipelago has a particular set of forms. So it's in the form of 36 sonnets. But you take that form and then just it. Um, recalling something you said about enjambment once, that enjambment is reaching toward the brim and then exceeding it. So you've taken the sonnet and its 14 lines and actually exceeded that, exploded that, you might say. So that kind of relationship, I think, that you're taking between lens, but then it's
Oh, Tausif, I think you just disappeared. There you are again.
Is he back?
Yes,
Let me see if I can.
but now you're muted, Tausif.
Yeah, let me see if I can get him. Where are you, Tausif? There he is. Okay.
okay. I
Okay.
apologize for the blip. And see, as much as technology bridges us together, it can also
Oh,
okay. So Wayne, are you able to hear me?
yeah, I heard you, and I heard everything that you said. I think about place. I mean, if I tell me if I missed out anything, but it was about place, and then you ended. The last thing I heard was about how I'm choosing this form of containment of the sonnet, but I am spilling over the brim of enjambment by making each
Yes.
line not just a line. And I guess the thing that so eloquently speaks to in my character and in my stance toward literary production is that I seek contained forms and a certain orderly fashion of going about the business of literature. I don't seek to destroy or upset or deviate, but I, in side by side with my tropism, my yearning for these forms of containment is this leakage, a kind of just leakage that I often might castigate as a form of laziness or sloppiness on my part, but I think comes from having always a sense of too muchness, that
Yes.
there's too much. I'm seeing too much. I want to say too much. I'm about to explode. And so that after doing the 3 volumes of the trance notebooks, pink trance notebooks, Camp Marmalade, and then
Yes.
Ultramarine, I wanted to choose a tidier form where I could say just a few things and arrange them in a like a spice cabinet, very nicely labeled, etc. But that I found myself both choosing often a kind of gnomic language as well as spilling over the edge of each line.
Right. And I the analogy of the spice cabinet is so wonderful because I think within specific types, one can produce infinite variety. I mean, this is the sort of my if once in my life I was like, yes, Foucault, language is a prison. I do feel trapped. Then I'm also like, well, there's so much possibility. We have both, the capacity to play with syntax, but also play with sound. One of the things that generates so much pleasure in your writing is that interaction, not just between meaning and syntax and order, but sound and affect and all these things that are, as you say, too much for certain modes of critical appraisal. And I think that too muchness, what I love about Subtle Archipelago that is so much in line with your work is that there is an acknowledgement of that too muchness, a recognition that one is doing too much as one is doing it, and a kind of, let's say, attempts to maybe come back and clean the mess a little bit, but always there's that residua, and that residua keeps, I think, the sort of engine of so much of your writing going. It's, it's the thought that you can't get out of your head. It's the obsession that generates, even after one has come back and mopped up the little spill, um, it still sticks. It's sticky.
What's suddenly striking me, I'm stuck on the spice cabinet now. And
Right.
when I see a spice cabinet, I see also the obsolescence and depletion and flavorlessness of for spices to be in a cabinet, at least the cabinets of
Right.
my youth that I remember, the Spice Islands, whatever, all those, it meant that they are already defunct. And so I think if we're just to sit with the spice cabinet for a second, and that the sense I had writing this book was that I was depleted and that my language was depleted, which is always what I feel at the end of projects. And so the reason that a writer writes a new book, I think if you're a
Mhm.
commercial writer or a writer, a novelist or something, you write books for many more practical reasons. But if you're a poet, there's no practical reason to write another book except this wish to regenerate oneself, to have another springtime. And so, to bring the foodstuffs back to life again. And I think I did that in these poems by exploring the sort of sonic leakage between words that you're saying. I'm just going to open the book for a second and see what,
Yes.
okay, like this is already so sick, the lines that I'm finding in there. Uh, urge for regeneration through cramming. Okay, this is on page 52. I say, stop mentioning lifelong tropism toward swollen, stolen, Stolen, italicized, which is like a German cake, Swiss miss, misbegotten, hello, Dolly. And so like the it's crazy in a way, but the travel that I'm making in very few words, in a sentence where I'm first of all saying, stop doing this, don't do this cramming thing that you're doing. But then I do it, and swollen turns into stolen, which turns into Swiss Miss. Talk about like nobody wants to drink Swiss Miss hot chocolate, which turns into misbegotten, and then into Hello Dolly. And Dolly maybe goes back to swollen and stolen, but so
Well,
yeah.
this is what I love about it. It's, you're reading this right now, and I love that you said it maybe goes back to, it's the sense that there's no finality. The reader and you yourself are taking this journey together, but there's no destination necessarily in mind, and the pleasure is in the taking of the journey itself. So I think as someone who, is invested, both of us are invested in criticism and the sort of act and task of appraisal. What I've found is that there are certain, let's say, schools of thought about criticism that suggest that one might have the final word, or if not, every critic is vying to have the final word. Whereas your modality is not that final word, but let's say that act, that risk of possibly making, these associative leaps that might not, you might get stuck, you might, kind of meet a dead end, but I find that it's that process of taking that leap, but then also every, destination that you reach, there's always the possibility of going further, whether through sound, whether through, these other associative logics. And what I love about that is that you go far enough along with Stubble Archipelago, with you, and you sort of jettison the idea that, one must come to these critical conclusions, and you suspend, as they say, that sort of disbelief or that resistance. And I think that is an act, in and of itself, that is so valuable and fun. It reminds us that, for those of us who are kind of, whether through profession or whether through some sort of, um I don't know, perversion, and sort of so inclined to come to conclusions and find these, like, um final lines of appraisal. It reminds us that there's always something more. There's always something that one can find interesting. I think of, the writer, the literary critic, Sian Nai, who says that interesting as an aesthetic judgment in our day and time is this catch-all. It's a kind of ambiguity in which you are sort of meant to justify why you find something interesting. You don't do that. You don't try to justify why something is interesting. It's interesting because you find it interesting. It's interesting because I might find it interesting too. So let's take that little trip.
But I'm also thinking it not in opposition to what you're saying, but as a supplement to it, that I am a closure queen also. It must be too, because of, first of all, from the precision of your critical work and the precision of your speaking right now, that there's a lot, even though you're taking detours in what you're saying, and there's a certain wonderful discursiveness and wandering, you're at each crossroads, you're choosing very precisely where you will next step. And one of the things that having the tight containers of these quasi sonnets permitted me were opportunities, a lot of opportunities for closure. And if I'm looking again at my book and I'm seeing that the way the poems end, it's not with I hope it's not with the poems don't end with a pontification or a statement that the world is like this, but they end with a clustering and a condensation. So one poem on page 71 ends, stroke utopia, Timothy Leary animism, visionary jolt via taint. Okay, so the visionary jolt via taint, just to end with that quasi obscenity in a way, taint, but it's also a decent word we can use tonight here. But
Yes.
visionary jolt via taint. The word doesn't ask permission, it's just there, and then it ends. And like another sonnet ends, seek non-toxic paint thinner if non-toxicity exists. Suspicious tingle on tongue augurs termination. And so I guess that there are for me these solemn way stations at the end of lines or at the end of poems where there is not, dialectical synthesis has not occurred, but there is a landing that has a certain tactility and a certain, or let's just call it orgasmic pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, here's the other thing. I also think that it ties in so beautifully with your history and current practice of performance, right? So it's the moment at which, let's say you have performed and you're waiting, let's like, for the applause, for the approval, for the acknowledgement that one has, performed all of these feats of language, these somersaults across syntax. And I think that kind of, uh, if not finality, but at least that pause or for that kind of recognition ties in so much to what you've been writing about for so long, about certain kinds of affects of humiliation, of shame, and things like that, wherein you are so, of course, so aware and cognizant of of the acts that you're performing, and already anticipating some kind of reaction. Those kinds of that anticipation is what I see at the end of these poems.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm remembering a stint of performances I did a year ago. I think it was a year ago at the Hammer Museum in Los
Mhm.
Angeles, where 10 minutes each hour during a show curated by Aram Moshiedi, I played the piano and vocalized, more or less impromptu, in the exhibit itself. And there would be a moment at the end of the 10 minutes when the light that was trained on me would go off. And that would signal that my 10 minutes were up. And I remember getting a feel, since I did this for 6 days in a row, 10 minutes at a very certain part of each hour, like from 1:50 to 2 and then 2:50 to 3. I began to get a feel for when the light was about to turn off and when I would be needing to reach a climax of sorts or achieve a temporary finality, but there's also the blessing that the turning off of the lights afforded me, whether or not I had prepared for it. The turning off of the lights at the end of the 10 minutes gave a kind of blessing to whatever I had just said. And so
Yes.
I guess I developed in a very self-forgiving and fortuitous relationship to our inability to finally choose when closure will come.
And what's so beautiful about what you just said about that is that, knowing that you have exceeded the bounds of the sonnet, it is this, well, I'm going to go there, but then I also, that calm that affords, the taint, that, that kind of period that punctuates the ends of these poems. And what you just said about that relationship between performance and, let's say, a kind of regulation of the self, and that kind of thing. I'm wondering, where then is the sort of backstage of
Mm.
these poems? Because I know that, these poems are you walking around New York, dictating into your phone, and then transcribing. There is this constant observation of the straight guy on the train, of others who, people who are perhaps not aware of being watched, which is the sort of signature of the flaneur. But where then, if all the world's a stage right now, where is the sort of backstage, or where do you find the backstage, the sort of dressing room of this collection?
For me, the backstage is in the reservoir of connotations behind
Mhm.
the sometimes oblique house fronts that the words offer the world. So I'm looking at the end of the second poem in the book. I say, how redux can you make East Germany, ducky? I get plumbed by rose thorn, a Jekyll teething ring. Cryptic in a way, but there's East Germany, there's being plumbed by rose thorn, which doesn't sound fun to be plumbed by rose thorn. It does suggest, I mean, so for me, it's like there's the backstage that has being professorial, I'll say, that has Rilke with the rose,
Mhm.
and that has a lot of stuff with the thorn, that has Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and that kind of homoerotic, vampiric doubleness, and that has teething ring with infancy and oral need and wordlessness, and that in lines that are just a little earlier, I say, cram him up, celebrate him crammed, revise the cramming, call the cram cream. So let's just call cream is the procedure of the book. and the backstage of that is milk, maybe low fat.
Right.
I mean, so there is, like, when you've been stirring, I'm stirring the language pot, and there are these crystallizations that come to the surface, and the backstory isn't a specific narrative that I'm hiding, but the sense of just the undertow through literature and history of, you could say, what I'm referring to, what I'm resting on.
Right. Right. It's an iceberg, right? So we are lucky that we get the cream that froths to the top, that richness. But all of that is supported by the sort of floating you know, matter. And I want to sort of hone in on the plumbing aspect of this,
Please.
because that, it is, going into these steps, plunging, one could say. And I'm going to do something a little fun, which is to quote you on you. So this is from Humiliation in 2011. Writing is a process of uh, of turning myself inside out, regurgitation. I extrude my vulnerable inner lining. I purge, and then I examine the contents, my expulsed interior, and begin the bloody interrogation. So always there is this reaching in and taking out, and it's the examination of the contents that I find so great about this, because it's, on the one hand, it's a matter of abjection, right? It's a sort of recognition of all the sort of filth that resides inside oneself, all the things that cause humiliation. But on the other hand, to examine those contents, to actually confront them, is a rejection of that abjection, right? Is that sort of um, proximity to the filth, to that which is regurgitated. And I think that proximity, where others would kind of increase their distance from it, that's what keeps that's what keeps the engine running, right?
I guess it's also, I am one of those writers, and there are many of them, and I love them all, who write about process,
Mhm.
and I'm thinking of also nonverbal artists, painters, sculptors, performers, whose art is about innards in some way, and about, it doesn't mean always just scatological or, the unhygienic. It has to do with the stickiness of being, and just
Mhm.
the the dampness and murk, and yes, abjection. Thinking of Kristeva's book Powers of Horror, which is very important to me in the writing of Humiliation. Thinking about all that stuff, and knowing that I'm one of the writers whose role isn't just to comment on the world, but to comment on my emergence into speech, and on the mire-filled, compromising, liquid, sticky, like the grossness of that
Right,
voyage into speech. And they're great. And I mentioned in the interview we did for Interview Magazine, I think I mentioned two writers like that, Elfriede Jelinek and Dodie Bellamy, who in
right.
many ways are not connected as writers, but both are always writing about how weird and icky, in a way, it is to be a writer, dealing with one's own body, one's own gender, how that gender is seen.
Yes,
You could say
yes,
our thrownness into the world, how gross it is
right.
to be thrown into existence in that kind of phenomenological way, that we're thrust into being and into language, and that makes us splat.
Yes.
And we
Yeah,
comment on the splat.
we comment on the spot, and precisely that embodiedness, the phenomenological aspect of it, that is what makes any writer's writing idiosyncratic, one's own embodied experience and perception and reception of the world. And it's also what enables, I think, in your writing, um, to apply the rigorous examination of a cultural object, text, whatever it might be, to turn that onto oneself. I think that just generates so much more than, let's say, self-affirmation, ego boosting, something like that. It allows us to actually reach further to recesses that we didn't know about. And, there's a moment in Stubble Archipelago in my PDF copy, it's on page 29, where speech comes in a very funny way, um, where you say, faux pas to ask for a blurber's copy. They dropped my praise from the book. No shame to be an omitted mouthpiece. I love that. I think you're muted, Wayne, actually.
Mute.
Okay.
Okay, that's all because
Omitted mouthpiece.
I did. It's because I coughed and I thought I muted myself, but then they said that I'm not allowed to. But here I am. Here I am. Uh, with that. So what was the last part? What was the very last thing that you said? The question.
Just the no shame to be an omitted mouthpiece.
Yes, yes.
There, yeah.
Yeah, just that. Well, when I was going to graduate school, and really like a long time ago in the 80s or whatever, there used to be a phrase under erasure. So and so was under erasure, and it was kind of a cool thing to be under erasure, and it could be that the entire population that one was a part of would be under erasure, and so that I think artists of my generation and of the generations afterwards, 80s, 90s, or whatever, we got familiar with what it was like to be scratched out. And not because we deserve special pity for being the scratched out people of our time, but that uh, we were familiar with being unheard, unread, but also with being misinterpreted, misunderstood, or whatever. And so when I think of no shame to be an omitted mouthpiece, means not just that my blurb got cut from that book, which did happen, and the writer did apologize, but it is still, you think, wow, whatever. There I was.
Yeah.
It's happened to all of us, or will happen to all of us one day. But that the when you were quoting Humiliation, my book, and you said that I was interrogating the bloody contents of my purge. I'm reading my own work. I am taking the liberty of seeing myself as a rejected thing, as a kind of illegible flotsam. That said, I try in my work to be very charming, to make jokes. Lest this conversation lead people to think that we're in pursuit of illegibility. I think that's not it. We're wishing to seduce.
Wishing to seduce, and that's why you put it on the page, right? So here's the thing. Many writers, I'm sure, it's just a sort of disposition, do undergo that process of rigorous self-examination, of looking at the muck, but few are willing to actually make that muck visible or make that process of examining that muck visible. So in the sense that, there's that sort of in your training, there was always that sort of specter of erasure or that anticipation of it. You sort of anticipate that by putting it there. And, this actually leads me to ask you about um, maybe a sort of cohort, or to use a wonderful term that the critic Brian Dillon uses, affinity that you might have with other sort of practitioners of cultural critics, of cultural criticism and analysis of both high and low. So for me, I've definitely mentioned to you this to you before, but you, Rhonda Lieberman, and Bruce Hanley are kind of my triad, right? You know, you're my big three. And I think it's because you each have both a love for the high and low, of course, but also almost a kind of inability to not put it out there, to not put that kind of embarrassment or humiliation, shame, rigorous examination thereof out there. And I think that is so striking. And I'm curious, do you find, I mean, of course, you and Bruce have done many conversations together, and Rhonda, of course, as well. And I'm just curious, like, what do you find in others? What kind of affinities do you find with other cultural
The thing that
critics?
you're saying about Rhonda and Bruce, both of whom I adore and
Yeah.
revere, it's a quivering that I get in me when I know that writing must happen is when I there's something inadmissible that I know I'm about to blurt out. My
Yes.
entire poetics and my pedagogy are probably based on feeling the irresistibility of those urges. And I know, writing is otherwise not worth doing for me, but I want to write because I suddenly say, "Oh my God, I want to say this thing because it's really occurring to me and it's burning me up, and I need to say it, and I know it's going to probably alienate some people, but I can't help it, and it maybe makes me giggle that
Yeah.
I offend a few people, not because I want to offend them, but I want to ratify my being by saying this
Right.
thing that I just can't help saying. It's a form of bad manners in a way which is why I
Yeah.
sometimes like Sacha Baron Cohen, I feel is my brother in this regard, or all of John Waters, but also somebody like Carolee Schneemann, who is referred to
Mhm.
very indirectly at a few points in the book.
Yes. Yes.
Very
Yes.
indirectly, that in a way I'm being too secretive, but I refer to her work at a few times as a quintessential artist who felt that for political and aesthetic reasons, as a painter and performer, she had to work through the material of her own body.
Right.
Absolutely literally. She had to work
Yes.
through her viscera. And this would make her, she understood, unsellable and unpopular. She would be the one, she understood, who would ruin the dinner party by bringing up this thing. And
Right.
she always did it with a sense of, she was a very gracious person
Mhm.
and very lovable and very kind and very generous to other artists. So but without, I don't have the kind of luminous uh altruism of her
Mm.
work. I think she was always thinking of bigger causes than I'm thinking of, but nonetheless, I identify with being that kind of artist who can't help but work with her own body and
Right.
and 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 understands that it makes one giggle to know that you're going to have to say this, which is why I love Dodie Bellamy's work, for example,
Right.
Krause's or Eileen Miles or so many other people. They just can't resist saying the decorum breaking fact. You
Right.
clogged
And
my toilet. That kind of,
yeah.
you did it. And
Right.
for me, it's often my dream. I just have to tell you, you know, the dream, even though you're not supposed to tell your dreams.
Right. And what I you've made such a wonderful connection between these artists, because what I see that in them and in you is it's that unspooling of the scroll, right?
Oh,
But
yeah.
then once it's placed in front of the reader, the viewer, etc., none of you are running away from it, right? You're standing there almost beside it, kind of expectant of well, here it is. But it's not an expectant kind of for approval or disapproval, but an expectance of acknowledgement, of recognition. And I find that the kinds of recognition that are at play in this collection are so wonderfully mediated. So there's a poem in which you talk about the apps, like talking to someone on the apps who's distant, miles away. Let's see if we can maybe actually read that section. Okay, yes, so I'm going to read the last stanza
Page.
of number 12. So this is on page 36.
Great.
Okay. Orange-leaved trees, death, life, interstice. Bananas 5 for $1, capitals bias. Folding underwear, a practice between dharma and sapphics. Stranger twink from 7,180 miles away, web dweller asks, quote, please, sir, can you help me get out of my country and keep me with you, end quote. 300 pounds says wow to headless photo, but, quote, I'm not looking, merely browsing, end quote. Defeated or redeemed, you decide.
Yeah, I am leaving it up to defeated or redeemed. You decide. I guess it's because I'm aware that those two little bit of uh kind of app chat
Yeah.
spits that I'm giving in this kind of documentary are abject. It's not clear
Mhm.
who's abject. Is it me or is it the other person that's abject? But there's a sense of peril and crisis. In a way, defeated or redeemed, you decide, is my most Apollonian line ever. It's where I'm really, it's really quite Apollonian. I'm stepping above the bacchanal and I'm saying, I'm like Portia in The Merchant of Venice. I'm saying, whatever, just let's let's just weigh the two and let's not judge
Mhm.
these practices.
Right.
Let's just enjoy the specificity of need.
And the being able to carry that ethos from let's say face-to-face interactions onto something that is mediated by a screen, by the app interface, that's not something typical. I have to say, based on personal experience, um to carry the kind of way, the ethos in which one carries themselves in the world onto interactions via app, via text, in the poem itself. That I think is, I mean, if it's Apollonian, definitely, but it's also, let's say, an invitation. Well, this is always what I think is going on, is that if the writer is the one playing with words and to keep playing them and playing with them and not empty them out. You've talked about feeling emptied out. It's this invitation through reference and allusion, through name dropping, etc., but also a kind of invitation to perhaps act within the space of the poem in a way that could be aspirational, that could be utopian, that could be whatever, but it's carrying certain ways of behaving in an ideal form onto the page, which I just love about that.
Thank you. I mean, the last three words of the book are, well, I say to back up a bit, I'm talking about a, 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 a Jacob's ladder tail, tongue hanging out my mouth. And then I say that my mouth is open for wafers, recantation, apricots. And what you're saying right now reminds me of the ambivalences and equivocations of those three words, and that my mouth is open for wafers, which is kind of communion, which implies the mouth of a sinner, but also a kind of abjectly expectant mouth, though they could be Necco wafers, that it doesn't have to be, but wafers are usually communion wafers. And then there's
Right.
recantation, which is quotation, singing twice,
Mhm.
or retraction and
Mhm.
apology, but then apricots. And it just seems when you're talking about the ethics, and of the way I'm talking about the app dwellers, the web dwellers. Apricots is a word on which no judgment can fall. Apricots are
Right.
apricots. And
Yes.
I like ending the book with something as kind of specific and maybe cubist or something, or the way that Gertrude Stein in Tender Buttons redeemed the noun, like that it's wafers, recantation. Those words travel through guilt and punishment in some way. But my mouth is open, and it's open for something as mute and tasty and ambivalent as an apricot.
You
And
decide, right?
you decide. Also, apricots. Now that we're
Yeah.
apricots are often dried. Apricots are
Right.
often not good.
Right.
Apricots are not peaches. T.S. Eliot saying,
Right.
"Dare I eat a peach?" They're not
Right.
tomatoes. They're not apples.
Right.
Apricots, I think I'm introducing as a kind of sullen member of the fruit
Right.
fellowship,
To which we both belong.
which belong. So is it time? Is it time to have questions?
I
Oh,
believe
have we
so.
exceeded our envelope?
Oh,
I'm
you
so
would never do that. I just wish there were like a Wayne and a Tausif channel I could just flip on and just
I know, and
spend the days watch.
Tausif recovered from the paralysis of hotel room limbo to do such
Yes.
a beautiful job.
Well, that's the thing. I'm no Joan Didion, I'm
You
not
can rise to the
disinterested.
occasion, right?
Right.
So we do have some questions starting to come through. So let me see if Nancy. Hello, Nancy. Nancy says, I like the play with containment, like the social constructions of experience, like no one wants to drink Swiss Miss, and also no woman wants to be like a Swiss Miss, nor watch Hello Dolly, nor be a Dolly, et cetera, et cetera. The backstories, the masquerades, the underbelly, the stickiness of being, emergence into speech, thrown into existence. Your poems show us the leakage in the presenting forms of experience. Could you discuss this, please?
Wow. Well, the thing I could discuss or just quickly say is I'm so glad uh, that here, I'm going to look at the question. Is it actually like there? Uh, Nancy, that's Nancy, that you acknowledge that no woman wants to be a Swiss Miss. That you're acknowledging that with every name, cultural name that I'm dropping here, Donatello's David, Kim Novak, Santa Maria della Salute, Gumby Legs, Kleenex, Descartes-limbed universe, Lana Turner's daughter Cheryl. Nobody wants to, I mean, with all due respect to Cheryl Crane, nobody wants to be in that position of the named or the contained. And so I guess I feel such empathy and love for all the names that I drop in my poems. So when I say Lana Turner's daughter, Cheryl Crane, I say it with absolute love and identification. Next question. Oh, Peter?
Oh, sorry. I got
That's okay.
I got muted. It happened to me this time.
Okay.
So Joe asks, you mentioned pedagogy and saying the irresistible, and I was wondering if you could expand on the ways your pedagogy and writing inform each other. Were there particular texts you were teaching while writing Stubble Archipelago or the Trance Trilogy?
Yes, lots of text. I mean, I tend to teach exactly what I'm doing and loving. So for the last few years, well, I've been having adventures beginning to make my own films. I've been teaching courses on the essay film, poetic cinema, stuff like that. I when I wrote my first novel, which was originally titled Moira Orphée in Egmont and was reissued as Circus, and a novel that was launched at City Lights in person in 2004. I was teaching a class called Extreme Fictions. When I was writing Humiliation, I taught a course called Humiliation. When I was writing about Andy Warhol, I taught a course called Andy Warhol. When I was writing about Harpo Marx, I taught a course called Stars. So when I was writing Stubble Archipelago, I'm always, whenever possible, giving my students assignments, weekly writing assignments to help them bridge the gap between life and art and to help them realize how quickly they can seize the materials of their everyday life and instantly transport them into prose or poetry. Just like by having a bag that you take around with you where you put stuff, as it were. And so that my job as a teacher is sometimes to give them the bag that they can stuff the stuff in. And with the bag comes a certain forgiveness clause. You don't have to interrogate it for a year. Give yourself a year to enjoy what you've collected and the amalgam that you've made of it. And then undergo the brutal examination.
Right. And there's a sense also, Wayne, in having that bag, the bag becomes your own. You might have given the students the bag, but then, again, it's your Anamorpho, it's your Elfriede Jelinek. I love that sort of encouragement to have such a personal relationship with text art theory. It's not theory doesn't become the sort of teacup that you pick up and put down and examine. It becomes actually much more amorphous, much more porous in your reading.
Yeah, thank you.
So Peter asks, could Wayne touch on how writing this book has been informed by or might inform his wonderful visual art practice?
Thank you, Peter, for that very nice question. I often, both in my films and in my paintings, I like to work within very small spaces. I've done a lot of paintings that are on by like 10-inch by 10-inch panels, or sometimes smaller. I like to paint on little discarded bits of cardboard. My films, when I first started making them, were under a minute long because they were on Instagram in the old days, and a minute was how long they had to be. And I loved that minute length. And I still, because I edit my films very densely and closely, I like concentrating them. So I guess that I understand, both as a painter and filmmaker working on small surfaces and as a writer working on the page, how there's only so much that you can squeeze in, I suppose. That sounds a bit gnomic. There's only so much you can squeeze in, since I think I've been advocating squeezing everything in. But as I'm thinking about that 10 by 10-inch panel, I'm realizing that if you have red and blue and an arrow and a fish and some squiggles, and there's maybe room for one dissonance, period. You can add one dissonance, but you can't add 15. And so you have to kind of isolate yourself in a certain chamber of thought where you're in search of the one dissonance that will solve the 10 by 10-inch frame. And I'd say in the writing process, there is this funny way that toward the end of revision, it's about one word, one sentence, one phrase. And you can artificially say to yourself, if I can find the right word here, it's done. And I think that's the magic that, for me, Wafer's recantation Apricots did. It was a personal magic that said, I squeezed in just enough and it's over.
It's very Beckettian to seek that word. That
It is. We're precise people, so we like
yes.
the right word.
Yes. Yes.
Maybe hard to answer. I'm just reading this. Peter, I'm absolving you of your duty. I didn't answer the phenomenology. I didn't. You're right. Sorry, Nancy. Okay, Samuel. Maybe hard to answer in the abstract, but when you're doing the work of reaching in and pulling out, turning yourself inside out, and looking at what you find, at what point does something you find appear abject or beautiful? Is it in the reflection, the writing, the imagining someone else reading or witnessing? The moment of the thing emerging into words always feels like redemption, feels like catharsis. It feels like physical excitement, like I just wrote this. It just it just exploded into being. A little later comes the thought, I of course can't publish that. And then I gradually come to terms with the fact that of course I must publish it. And I'm a big, if somebody needs a pep talk in my circle, if somebody needs a pep talk about whether or not they should publish something that they've written because they think it's too out there, I'm the person to come to, because I'm going to always say, of course you should publish it. As I've said to friends and students of mine, if you don't, you know that you've written something worthwhile if you wake up in the middle of the night feeling horrified by the fact that you've written it. That seems to me, based on my experience, a really good sign that you've put a sufficient amount of risk into the enterprise.
Absolutely.
But we find ourselves at the top of the hour. And Tausif, did you have anything you wanted to address before we sign off?
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Wayne, for continuing our wonderful conversation. We could keep doing this, and we will keep doing this.
They'll keep doing this.
Yes. So thank you. And thank you all. Thank you, Peter, for helping us come together for such a wonderful event. I feel very, very delighted.
You too. I love City Lights. I love Peter. I love Tausif. And I love writing. So it's a happy night.
It's a happy
Okay.
day.
Okay.
Well, you
Well,
are both exquisite, and very, very fond of you both. And thank you for doing this. And Wayne, congrats on another terrific book. Tausif, thank you for doing the honors. And always a big shout out,
Yes.
as always, to Hetty down at Semiotext.
Yes, Eddie,
All-
Yes.
yes, for this book, for making this
Yes.
book real.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
we love you, Hetty.
Yeah.
We love you, Eddie.
Okay.